we wanted to try and do was get behind the headlines really, and try to understand some of the backstory that show how people are products of their life and their sort of lifetime of choices.
Congratulations on the documentary. I watched it. It is fascinating and truly intriguing. What made you want to create this documentary about Prince Andrew?
Well, I think one of the fascinating things is that we've been peppered with these headlines about the Andrew story, right, for the last 3, 4, 5 years, and the story we think we know of Andrew's has sort of suddenly popped up in the press, but we suspected that there was a much longer trajectory to it, right? It doesn't just happen overnight. And when we took the lid off and started to dive into Andrew's backstory, we discovered this really kind of fascinating life arc that we wanted to explore further, and unfortunately Peacock did too.
Yeah, I mean, what fascinated you the most about his backstory?
I think what was really interesting is that we have baked into our heads now the image of the sort of 60-something-year-old Andrew and his recent fall from grace, but it was truly incredible to see this scale and fervor of that footage of him as a sort of 20-something and a national hero, like a genuine national hero after the Falklands. Falklands for the UK was sort of the great conflict in a way since the Second World War, and he came home to a hero's welcome, and it was a very, very starkly different Andrew that we saw at that age.
Yeah, I mean, what would you kind of pinpoint the start of like the decline of Prince Andrew? What would you say like was that like almost turning point moment for him?
I think in a way, it's actually, there isn't a single moment, but it seems to have been, it's like a trickle effect, isn't it? Most of us aspire to a life where we get a job and we get a promotion and we kind of go up in the world. That's our general trajectory. But it was Tina Brown who kind of underlined the point that for Prince Andrew, he started as a teenager, 20-something, and second in line to the throne. He was the guy who was going to be the king and head of the Commonwealth if Prince Charles, for whatever reason, didn't make it. But from there, he's been gradually knocked down the pecking order to 9th, where he is today, and become somebody who's less and less important in their job, in inverted commas. And I think it's really fascinating to sort of understand that. And it makes you look at his trajectory in a different light.
Right. And I mean, he may have been bumped down the pecking order, but he was also the favorite in the Queen's eyes. I mean, why do you think that he was maybe not treated differently, but held in such regards in her eyes, I guess?
I mean, this is what we were told by a lot of people. And I think actually the thing that I hadn't really understood or ever kind of clocked previously is the huge age gap between children. That Prince Andrew and Edward after him were seen as her second family. And that she plowed a huge amount of energy into being their mum and being around and raising them and having them close to her. And I think that probably then echoed through the rest of their lives. And as is reported, he was said to be sort of physically very close to her right through her old age as well.
Right. And, you know, he lived this life of privilege, of entitlement, and nobody could really say no to him. I mean, he kind of bypassed security when he had, you know, visitors coming in and things like that. I mean, obviously, you know why he lives the life of entitlement, but like, how extreme did he take that?
Quite a long way, according to what we were told in the interviews that we were given. You know, the lot of a documentary maker is that you can only ever hear the story of the people who will sit down and tell it to you. But I think it was really enlightening those who, as you will have seen yourself, we had on the one hand, the journalists who have not just sort of dabbled in the royal story, but covered it for decades. And also those people who worked within the Crown operation and therefore were alongside him all day, every day in their professional capacity. And it was pretty eye-opening, some of the stories they told us. Yeah,
especially the teddy bears, how he had like 40 teddy bears lined up on his bed. That like stood out to me.
It's remarkable.
It really is. I mean, this also dives into his relationship, of course, with Jeffrey Epstein. And, you know, this is definitely a dark story, but he was very much immersed in his life. I mean, Jeffrey even paid off some of his debts. So they were a very close had a very close friendship.
As we understand it, certainly closer than he was suggesting in his interview, mate list, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, when you watched that interview of him, what was your initial reaction?
I mean, much like the interviewees in the doc, my jaw hit the floor. I mean, it's just the inability to comprehend or factor in other people's suffering or situations, and only think of his. He seemed to be very self-focused.
Right. Yes.
Very focused on his own path, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, to stepping back on it, I mean, how monumental is this story, and how much did it really shake the monarchy? Because, Queen Elizabeth had to strip him of his HRH titles. He, no longer a working member of the royal family. Like, what is the magnitude, in history of Prince Andrew's, interactions with Jeffrey Epstein?
I think in a way, the reason that it has reverberated so strongly is because it's contemporary, right? Look back, I mean, it's not really possible to compare it historically, because if you look back 200 years, the kinds of behavior that he's accused of is a whole different ballgame. It's a whole different society. But we live in a very different world, and not only in terms of the Me Too movement and all those kinds of things, but also as a nation in how we perceive the royal family and the taxpayers' money that goes into funding their operation and this kind of thing. And that comes with certain expectations. And I think in a way it was more that it's as much the sort of contemporary cultural shift that has made his story particularly rise to the top and become so extraordinary. And then, of course, being associated with Jeffrey Epstein, it's almost instantaneously game over.
Right. I mean, why do you think Ghislaine has remained silent so far? I mean, just in your opinion.
Extremely good question.
Yeah.
Extremely good question. I would imagine that there is some calculation that goes on, right, about your loyalty to your friends on the one hand and your personal predicaments on the other, and only she can weigh those two things up and decide what to do with them.
I mean, you said, I believe one of the lawyers that you speak to in the documentary says that Prince Andrew should still be nervous about all this. And do you agree with that?
That's what he told us. So we will, only time will tell.
Yeah, only time will tell. I mean, when people watch this documentary, what are you hoping that they take away? What are you hoping they learn watching this documentary?
I think what's really interesting about it is, particularly as a British filmmaker living in the US and working here, what we wanted to try and do was get behind the headlines really, and try to understand some of the backstory that show how people are products of their life and their sort of lifetime of choices. And also just to try and through osmosis, not by kind of telling you it, but showing you it, that the dynamic that has always existed and continues to exist between the press and the public and the royal family. It's kind of a complicated triangular relationship. And it's going to be really fascinating, I think, to see where it goes from here.
Yeah, I was going to say, where do you think Andrew fits in this new monarchy, if he does at all?
Collectively, in the last five, that's the question that we had at the end of our story, and in the last 5 minutes of the film, you'll see that collectively our interviewees pretty much discount him from any future important role. But I think, regardless of exactly what happens to him, for a long time there have been indications that the future of the monarchy is a slimmed down monarchy focused on the direct line of succession. So regardless of what he's of his personal story in the last couple of years, I suspect that he was always going to be more of a fringe player in the future.
For more news content and exclusive interviews, make sure to hit the sub, like, and bell button down below, and visit usmagazine.com.